Technological progress does not stand still, and over the past decade, the resolution of images of the lunar surface has improved greatly. Many pits have been discovered on the surface, and some of them are really impressive in size. The largest are hundreds of feet deep. However, technology is not yet advanced enough for us to study the bottom of such pits in detail. That's why a recent discovery is surprising. It turns out that huge pits can extend deep into the rock of the moon. It's a groundbreaking discovery. Let's figure out why. So look at this giant underground cave. Leonardo Carrere and Lorenzo Bruzone from the University of Trento were thrilled to finally confirm the existence of such structures on the moon. They analyzed images taken by the mini RF instrument on board the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2010. The original images didn't have excellent resolution, so the authors had to do a huge amount of work, using modern data analysis and modeling techniques. But first things first, why does it all matter so much? Well, instead of building homes on the surface of the moon, we might be able to live inside these natural caves. They could offer protection from dangerous things like harmful space radiation, extreme temperature swings, and even meteorites. According to planetary geologist Wes Patterson from Johns Hopkins, even though we'd still have to bring materials from Earth to make those caves habitable, using them would be a lot easier and cheaper than building bases on the surface. Based on the collected data, the cave is about 150 feet wide and up to 260 feet long, which is just a bit smaller than a football field. It's located in a deep pit called the Mare Tranquillitatis Pit, which likely formed when an ancient lava tube collapsed. Although the moon has no active volcanoes today, billions of years ago, its surface was covered with lava that flowed through valleys, carving out these tubes below the surface. Over time, some of the lava tubes became unstable and collapsed, creating pits like the one in question. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, has already found more than 200 of such pits on the moon. It means there could be hundreds of hidden caves waiting to be explored on our satellite. When publishing their findings in Nature Astronomy, the researchers suggested that the caves could offer future astronauts a safe place to live and work, protecting them from the moon's extreme conditions. And extreme they are. One of the biggest challenges of living on the moon is its temperatures. The lunar surface gets extremely hot during the day, reaching about 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the temperature drops below minus 200 degrees Fahrenheit at night. But inside the caves, the temperature could stay much more consistent. A separate study done in 2022 used computer simulations to predict that some of those caves could maintain a comfortable temperature of about 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Much easier to manage, right? Unfortunately, getting to the caves won't be easy. The Mare Tranquillitatis cave is over 400 feet below the surface, at the bottom of a steep slope covered in loose debris. It would take some clever engineering to get up and down that slope. The options could be using jetpacks, a lunar elevator, or some other kind of technology. We must find a way to transport astronauts safely. There's also a lot more to discover. Radar technology could help scientists find even more caves and lava tubes on the moon. In the future, a spacecraft with higher resolution radar could even map the insides of the pits that LRO has already found. According to the researchers, this kind of complete survey could help them figure out the best locations for future lunar bases and other explorations. And there's another potential bonus. Those caves could contain water. Scientists have already found frozen water on the moon, under the surface, and in permanently shadowed craters. Tiny amounts are also scattered across the lunar dirt. Water is a critical resource for any moon base, and finding it in the caves could make the idea of living there even more realistic. All in all, this discovery could be a game changer for lunar exploration. Living in natural caves on the moon might be a more practical and safer option than building something on the surface. It could also bring us one step closer to making the moon a place where humans can live and work for the long term. What if our moon was hollow? Would we be able to hide inside in case some terrible catastrophe destroyed our home planet? Well, the supporters of the hollow moon theory believe that it's actually a real option. The hollow moon is a hypothesis claiming that Earth's moon is either completely hollow or has quite a lot of place inside. The thing is, the moon is less dense than Earth, and it seems to support the idea of its hollowness. But according to science, the reason is the fact that Earth's upper mantle and crust are less dense than the heavy iron core of our planet. Then, There's also the claim that the moon rings like a bell. For almost a decade, between 1969 and 1977, seismometers installed on the moon by the Apollo missions kept recording moonquakes. The moon was reported to be ringing like a bell during such quakes, especially shallow ones. On the 20th of November, 1969, Apollo 12 deliberately crashed the ascent stage of its lunar module into the surface of our natural satellite. According to NASA, after that, the ringing continued for almost an hour. This made some people argue that the moon must be hollow like a bell. Later, lunar seismology researched those shallow moonquakes and showed that they acted differently than quakes on our planet, mostly due to differences in type, texture, and density of the lunar and Earth's rock layers. The speed of sound waves in solids is determined by the medium's compressibility and density. No one has ever found any evidence of a large empty space inside the moon. And still, in 1970, Michael Vasson and Alexander Sherbakov suggested a hypothesis that the moon could be a spaceship designed by mysterious extraterrestrial beings. In 1965, writer Isaac Asimov made an observation that added fuel to the fire of conspiracy theories. He marveled at the sheer astronomical accident that the moon fits so snugly over the sun during total eclipses. The sun's greater distance makes up for the incomparably larger size of the star. As a result, it seems to us that the moon and the sun are the same size. The author added that there was no astronomical reason why the sun and the moon should fit so well. So since the 1970s, conspiracy theorists have been quoting Asimov's words about solar eclipses as evidence of the artificial origin of the moon. Mainstream astronomers disagree with such an interpretation, saying that the angular diameters of the moon and the sun don't perfectly match during eclipses. They vary by several percent over time. Many other pieces of evidence confirm that the moon is a solid body that formed after a planetoid crashed into Earth. In the past, scientists thought that the moon appeared after our rapidly spinning planet got rid of a good chunk of its mass. This idea was suggested in 1879 by George Darwin, the son of the very Charles Darwin, the famous biologist. This theory remained popular until the Apollo missions. Then, in 1925, Austrian geologist Otto Ampferer offered another idea, that Earth and the moon could have formed together from a primordial accretion disk, a rotating disk of dense gas and dust surrounding a young, newly formed star, and used to be a double system. The third theory stated that the moon could have once been a planetoid caught by the gravity of our planet. The modern explanation usually involves the giant impact hypothesis. According to it, a Mars-sized space body hit Earth and created a debris ring around our planet. In the end, this ring gathered into a single natural satellite, our moon. But getting back to the hollow moon theory, at the moment, there's no scientific evidence to support this hypothesis. Seismic observations and other data indicate that the moon has a solid interior with several layers, a thin crust, quite extensive mantle, and a dense core. These days, the idea of the hollow moon is considered to be a conspiracy theory.
There are a few theories about how the moon appeared in the sky, and recently a new idea has popped up. But before we discuss this newcomer, let's look at the most popular hypotheses of the moon's formation. The capture theory claims that Earth's natural satellite used to be a wandering body, something like a large asteroid. It had formed somewhere else in the solar system before it was captured by our planet's gravity when passing nearby. The accretion hypothesis suggests that the moon formed in orbit around Earth at the same time as our planet appeared in the darkness of the cosmos. Then, there's the fission theory that says that at one point in its development, Earth was spinning so fast that some of its material broke away and started to orbit the planet. And the giant impact theory, which is the most popular these days, claims that the moon formed during a collision between Earth and another hypothetical planet called Theia, which was way smaller, probably the size of Mars. The resulting debris collected in an orbit around Earth and formed the moon. And now, let's move to the new theory you've been patiently waiting for. According to it, our satellite might have formed immediately, in a matter of hours, after the collision between Earth and Theia. The material from the two planets was likely launched directly into Earth's orbit right after the impact. It formed the Moon and left traces deep inside Earth. In previous scenarios, Theia's remains were thought to have been scattered all over space, mixing with just a bit of the material coming from our own planet. But then, why do we see such shocking similarities between the Moon's and Earth's compositions? Could it be that Theia was isotonically and chemically similar to Earth? Unlikely. But according to the new theory, more material from Earth was used to create the Moon, its outer layers in particular. It might explain this similarity in composition. One more theory also tries to explain this mysterious similarity, the synestia model. According to it, our satellite formed inside a swirl of vaporized rock left by the collision. But this theory can't explain the Moon's current orbit. The new single-stage theory does offer us plausible explanations for both the similarities in composition and the orbit of the Moon. It might also provide us with some answers to previously unsolved mysteries. Since this scenario puts the Moon into a wider orbit and gives it an interior that is not fully molten, it can explain the satellite's tilted orbit and thin crust. In any case, to confirm one of these theories, we need to analyze future lunar samples that will be brought to Earth by NASA's upcoming Artemis missions. Scientists will be able to get their hands on some material from deeper beneath the Moon's surface and compare if real data matches these simulated scenarios. In the past, the Apollo missions already brought back about 1/3 of a ton of rock and soil from our satellite. These samples showed that Earth and the Moon had some remarkable chemical similarities. They could only suggest one thing. These space objects had a linked history. If the Moon had formed elsewhere and been captured by our planet's gravity later on, its composition would be very different from that of Earth. But if the Moon had been created at the same time as Earth, or if it had broken off our planet, the type and proportion of minerals on the Moon would be the same as on Earth. But they are a bit different. The Moon's minerals contain less water than their terrestrial counterparts. The satellite is also richer in materials that form rapidly at high temperatures. That's why the most accepted model of the Moon's formation these days is the giant impact model. Meteorites coming from the Moon are a great source of data for studying the origins of our satellite too. They can tell us even more about the Moon than Apollo samples, all because such meteorites come from all over the surface of the Moon. Meanwhile, Apollo samples were collected just in one place near the equator, on the near side of the Moon.
What if we built a huge tower on the Moon? A tower that could provide future missions with light, power, and guidance technologies that could help astronauts explore our natural satellite. It's not something from a sci-fi book. It's a novel idea from Honeybee Robotics, one of the brightest space technology companies. The lunar utility navigation with advanced remote sensing and autonomous beaming for energy redistribution, or simply Lunar Saber, is a 328 tall pole. It's capable of holding 1 ton of equipment on top of it. But how could we build such a giant construction? No rocket would be able to hold and land such a giant pole on the Moon. And building such a tower on the lunar surface without already existing infrastructure would be next to impossible. So, Honeybee might use the deployable interlocking actuated bands for linear operations Diablo system. It uses a rolled piece of metal and bends it into a deployable cylindrical structure that can support really heavy payloads. It would be easier to build it on the Moon because gravity there is only 16% of that on Earth. The structure could serve as the base for Lunar Saber. Power is crucial on the Moon, so putting solar panels along the sides of the pole would be super useful. The company is now discussing 2 types of solar panels. The first one is like a yo-yo extended from the top payload holder of the tower. It would envelop the metallic structure and allow access to the sun at all angles. The second option might involve the top part of the tower. It could deploy its booms to hold traditional solar panels and then track the sun. Power supply wouldn't be the only Lunar Saber's task. It would also be able to beam power to other devices, track other devices, and provide communication, light, and energy. Let's talk about these functions in more detail. If one mast of the pole was bathing in sunlight while another was lingering in shadow, the one with excess power would be able to beam power to the one lacking it. Plus, similar power beaming could happen between Lunar Saber and rovers and astronauts in spacesuits. To beam all that power effectively, though, the tower would need to know the precise location of those objects. That's where the second technology would come in. Lunar Saber could use a set of sensors to find and track other objects. Basically, anything in a direct line of sight could be tracked and powered by the tower itself. Lunar Saber could also act as a lunar cell phone tower. It would allow wireless communication in its network. And finally, it would be super helpful for astronauts to actually see where they would be going. Rovers wouldn't need to wait out the 2-week lunar darkness. Floodlights at the top of the tower could provide enough visible light for astronauts and rovers, which would allow them to effectively perform their activities at all times. But guess what? The tower could become even more useful. We could combine several towers in a mesh. It would allow astronauts to communicate more effectively. Plus, power could be beamed even from the other side of the moon. It would enable 2 main applications that have been a thorn in lunar exploration's side so far: constant communication with Earth and constant supply of solar power. The thing is, explorations on the other side of the moon are quite tricky, which limits the area of scientific research to the side directly facing Earth. But a strategically placed mesh of lunar sabers could allow communication back to Earth, and we would be able to explore the dark side of the moon. Since at least half of our natural satellite is always lit up, if we placed lunar sabers correctly around the surface of the moon, there would always be at least one bathing in sunlight. That one sunlit tower would then wirelessly transmit power to others in its line of sight. This process would keep going until power was beamed to the main astronauts' base, supplying them with power even in the cold lunar darkness. Unfortunately, at the moment, such technologies look unrealistic. We're not close to having wireless energy transmission over long distances. Even on Earth, we still need to use batteries and wires. It might be easier to launch many satellites into orbit around the moon than to create a network of giant communication towers.
The moon's surface has millions of craters, but something else has drawn a lot of attention to it. A giant rare hole that turned out to be a tube. It was found when the Japanese lunar orbiter was gathering data around the moon's skylight, the tube's entrance. Researchers found a specific echo pattern that suggested there was a hollow area. They discovered more echo patterns at a couple of places near the hole, so there could be more lunar tubes there. But in this big tube, you could place an entire football field and the pit could swallow it whole. It's irregularly shaped and 427 feet in diameter. Scientists think that there could be secret caves, a tunnel system, or an entire geological wonderland under the surface. It could be a good shelter for astronauts that land on the moon, or even be a harbor for a lunar colony. No one ever managed to stay on the moon for more than 3 days because of the conditions on the satellite. It has a wide range of temperatures, low atmosphere, and no magnetic field that would protect life on the surface from things like radiation or harsh sun rays. Astronauts wear spacesuits, but they can't protect them over long periods of time. But a lava tube could. When a lava flow cools, it gets a hard crust, which later thickens and creates a roof over that same lava. It continues to flow, but when it stops, the channel can drain, which results in an empty tube. Our planet also has lava tubes, but they're not as big as the one found on the moon. There's a special type of tree called a moon tree. It's grown from seeds that were taken into space during one of the missions and then returned back to Earth. You can find this kind of tree growing across the US. Earth is 27% bigger than the moon and far more massive. Our gravity is stronger. If you drop a rock on the Earth, it will fall faster. 150 pounds on Earth is just 25 pounds on the moon. The Earth has numerous satellites circling around it, but the moon is the only natural one. Our moon was formed during a big collision of the Earth and one more planet the size of Mars. This happened around 4.6 billion years ago, shortly after the Sun and our solar system were formed. After the collision, a cloud of vaporized rock went into orbit around our planet, cooled, and shaped into a ring of small solid bodies. They later got together and became the Moon, leaving craters as a reminder of this collision. If you're standing on the surface of the Moon, your shadow will be darker than on Earth. This is because there's no atmosphere to scatter light and create lighter shadows. One of Jupiter's moons, Io, has hundreds of volcanoes and pretty wild eruptions, sometimes sending plumes 250 miles into the atmosphere. These eruptions happen because of the extremely strong gravity this moon is exposed to. Its insides tense up and relax in those periods when it gets closer to and then further from Jupiter, which generates enough energy for insane volcanic activity. It's not just planets, even quite small space bodies sometimes have moons. In 1993, researchers discovered a 20-mile wide asteroid and its 1-mile wide moon. You'd need 400,000 moons to match the brightness of our central star, the Sun. The moon reflects the light it gets from the Sun, but it doesn't produce its own. That brightness depends on the angle between the moon, the Earth, and the Sun. Our moon is around 32 Earths away from us, and 29 Earths at its closest. When the night is dark and clear, it seems like you can touch a full moon. But if you wanted to do it, you'd have to travel up to 250,000 miles. Still, there is water on the moon. Not puddles or lakes, but grains of water ice exist in permanently shadowed parts near the moon's poles. Scientists think that water got on the moon a long time ago, during a period when both the moon and Earth were constantly struck by asteroids and comets, which contained water ice. This process may have even helped us get our own lakes and oceans, not just the moon's icy water. Newer research says that the moon's interior already had water, and it went to the surface during volcanic activity. The same might have happened on our planet too. Out of 200 moons in our solar system, our moon is the 5th biggest one. Jupiter's moon Ganymede is the biggest one, almost 1.5 times bigger than ours. Apollo 11 was the mission where humankind first landed on the moon. It was a very important moment, broadcast all over the world. But it was almost interrupted by a huge windstorm that was going on in Australia back then. Parker Dish was placed there, which was something we used to get the broadcast signals from the moon. The moon is not a perfect circle. It's more in the shape of an egg, with the thicker end pointing toward us. This shape is derived from its rotation. A full moon can keep you awake. Studies showed that people experienced less deep sleep, and it took them longer to fall asleep during the full moon period. It wasn't about its brightness, but the lunar cycle that influences our internal body clock. Each year, the moon is moving away from Earth because of the interaction between the moon's gravitational force and our oceans. In 1 year, it moves around 1.5 inches away, which means that in around 600 million years, it will be 14,600 miles further from Earth than it is now. This number isn't accidental. That's the time when total solar eclipses will stop happening. Humankind hasn't set foot on the moon in a few decades, but footprints there are still fresh because there are no winds up there, so these tracks can stay there for millions of years. The moon has its own time zone called Lunar Standard Time. Time is different on the moon, so a year there is divided into 12 days, considering each is as long as our month. Days got named after astronauts who walked on the moon. The moon calendar starts the moment Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in 1969. There are possible energy sources for living beings on one of Saturn's moons. It has an ocean under the surface, and it may feature some chemical reactions similar to those that help certain forms of life on our planet survive. The moon used to have active volcanoes, probably during the time of the dinosaurs. Molten lava hardened on its surface billions of years ago, which helped create unique lunar craters, but the volcanoes have been dormant for a long time now. The moon has earthquakes, or rather, moonquakes. Just like our planet, the moon also has a crust that goes through changes and shifts. Shaking occurs when its crust warms and expands, or it can even be caused by meteorite impacts. Moonquakes are not as strong as earthquakes, but can last way longer since the moon doesn't have enough water to prevent seismic vibrations. The moon has a big range of temperatures because it doesn't have an atmosphere. During the day, it can go up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, but at its poles, the temperature is around -400 degrees Fahrenheit. In 2019, astronauts discovered a strange space phenomenon. The moon was crossing in front of the sun, and at one moment, it seemed like it stopped and then started moving backward. It's the same optical illusion like when you're driving on the highway and pass a car that's slower than you. At one moment, as you move ahead, it may appear like it's going backward. The crust of the moon is not equally thick in all its parts. Some are up to 37 miles thick, while others are much thinner. The moon itself doesn't change colors. When sunlight goes through our atmosphere, it reflects off the moon and makes us see it as pink or red. Sometimes there are particles of dust sent into the atmosphere, and in combination with sunlight, they give the moon an orange glow. The moon doesn't have a dark side. There's only a far side that we can't see from the Earth. The moon spins on its axis once and makes a circle around the Earth, all in the same amount of time, which is why we only see its one face the entire time. All planets in our solar system have at least one moon, except for Mercury and Venus. Mercury has less mass than our planet, so its gravity is lower than ours, around 38% of the Earth's gravity. That means 100 pounds on Earth would be 38 pounds on Mercury. Because of the weaker gravity, and since it's so close to the Sun, Mercury wouldn't be able to have its own moon. It would probably crash into Mercury, or even go into orbit around the Sun, and someday even get pulled into it. Venus most likely doesn't have its moon because it's also too close to the Sun.
Hey, wake up! Quick, listen to that. It's a 5-second FM signal coming from one of Jupiter's moons. You fumble for your phone and inform your colleagues. They freak out over the news and rush to the lab. You've been a scientist working with the Juno probe, exploring Jupiter for years. But this is the first time you've witnessed something so unusual. Ganymede is Jupiter's largest moon and the biggest moon in our solar system. If this space body didn't orbit around Jupiter, it would be classified as a planet. It's even bigger than Mercury and Pluto. What makes this moon stand out among others is the fact that it has its own magnetic field. The moon was born around 4.5 billion years ago. It means it's as old as Jupiter itself. This planet-sized space body takes 7 Earth days to orbit its planet. Everyone gathers at the laboratory, impatiently waiting for you to play the recording of the signal coming from space. Your colleagues get their game on, trying to figure out what the source of this mysterious sound is. Around 40% of Ganymede's surface is dark, with craters scattered around, and 60% is light-colored. There are formations that were probably caused by tectonic activity or the release of water from under the surface. Scientists managed to discover a thin layer of oxygen trapped in the moon's atmosphere. The temperatures there are super low, between -170 to -200 degrees Fahrenheit. There isn't much information about how the moon behaves or what chemical elements it hides inside. Some of your colleagues try to create the same conditions that existed when the sound was transmitted. For hours, they sit there waiting, but nothing. Maybe it was a fluke. You get to the control system and activate the Juno spacecraft. The main point of this mission is to observe Jupiter's gravity, magnetic fields, the atmosphere, and the planet's evolution. By the way, there's also some evidence that Jupiter's largest moon is evolving too. Since it has a magnetic field surrounding it, auroras pop up all the time. Those are glowing gas circling the moon's north and south poles. If life existed in such a place, it would probably be at the bottom of Ganymede's extremely salty ocean. For a long time, scientists thought that the sun was a crucial component to kickstart life. But now we know that there are organisms dwelling deep at the bottom of the oceans. Those are doing just fine without sunlight. The oceans of our planet are teeming with some of the most bizarre creatures of all shapes and sizes. Sea lilies live some 10,000 feet underwater. They got their name because they look like flowers, except they're not plants but animals. Don't be fooled by their stems and leaves. Those are body parts equipped with nerve endings to detect food around them. Goblin sharks are probably some of the most weird-looking sharks that live at the bottom of the ocean. They can grow up to 12 feet long and have a very unusual snout. Now, take a look at the anglerfish. It has a bioluminescent blob on its head to attract prey and navigate its way around the dark ocean floor. It's a natural flashlight that never needs new batteries. It's only the females that have these flashlights, though. The blobfish is another bizarre animal living down there. It lives in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, 9,000 feet under the surface. Anyway, even though you asked everyone to keep the news confidential, it somehow leaks to the media and becomes a new trending topic. You get a call from a news agency. They say they want to interview you about this breakthrough that may prove life exists in outer space. The next day, you head down to the news station to talk about your discovery. You have a whole live studio audience watching your every move as you reach out to grab your glass of water. The crew scurries around doing some last-minute checkups before you're live on air. The makeup artist does some final brush-ups. The sound engineer asks you to test your mic once more. Several of the producers are sitting in the front seats. Bright lights are flooding the studio. The countdown begins. 3, 2, 1, and you're introduced, and the host asks you to explain what it was that you heard. You tell them about the Juno space probe orbiting Jupiter. After a couple of questions, the host finally brings up the most dreaded one. Might the mysterious sound be coming from another civilization? Everyone leans in, waiting for you to answer. You freeze, not knowing what to say. Even though the crushing pressure at the bottom of the ocean is 1,000 times stronger than at sea level, life still exists there. Algae, which is considered a delicacy in the ocean world, is off-menu for deep-sea creatures due to a lack of sunlight. Many of these bottom dwellers have to munch on leftovers instead. Those sink down there from the upper layers of the ocean. The freezing temperatures and the intense pressure have altered the cells of these creatures. This has made them more resilient than the average fish. Bacteria were developing their own ways of surviving. Studies show that they feed on certain gases and chemicals, like sulfur and carbon dioxide. Methane and hydrogen are released when tectonic plates move against each other, and some of these bacteria feast upon those gases too. Tardigrades, also known as water bears, are microscopic critters that can live and thrive in extreme conditions. You can find them in volcanoes, frozen glaciers, and even in the empty void of space, which means that some life forms might actually exist on Ganymede. You explain this to your audience. Then you mention that you don't have enough information to determine if it was another civilization or a natural phenomenon that produced the sound. This doesn't mean that the bottom of Ganymede's freezing oceans isn't teeming with its own bizarre and weird creatures. There might be some legendary beasts like the Kraken or Leviathan there, or weird glowing fish with 2 heads, a fish with tentacles and a large fin, giant crabs. The bacteria there might be as varied as our own. The plants, if they exist there, have to be strong enough to survive the sub-zero temperatures. The animals on Jupiter's largest moon could be as big as our blue whales or as tiny as plankton. After the interview, you head back to the lab to examine the records once more. On your way home, you see posters of yourself with captions like, "Are we not alone?" Hey, you've become a celebrity. Many people take pictures of you. You've been booked by other agencies for more interviews. Some science magazines even want to put you on the front cover as the Person of the Year. Every time you come to work, you wait for the sound to appear again. But nothing. You send a signal from the Juno probe, trying to make some sort of contact with whatever produced the sound. Nothing. That night, you pass out on your desk once more. Eureka moment wakes you up in the middle of the night. There might be something you've missed. You run the numbers again and realize that the answer was in front of you this whole time. It wasn't another civilization that produced this sound. The source was electrons. Every planet produces its own sound. It's created when charged particles from the solar wind and the planet's magnetosphere interact with one another. That's what happened on Ganymede. The electrons in its magnetic field, where the probe picked up the signal, were acting stranger than usual, and this amplified some irregular frequencies. You're embarrassed and spend the rest of your night making phone calls, telling your team the news. The agency that interviewed you releases a statement. They explain that other civilizations aren't trying to contact us. You sit back at your desk, waiting for the next big thing to happen. Europa is another of Jupiter's moons that may host life. It's made up of an iron core, a mantle, and a salty ocean, twice the volume of all the oceans on Earth. And just like Ganymede, the ocean lies under a water ice crust. Scientists claim that there might even be active volcanoes there, and some resilient bacteria may live there. With enough water, certain chemicals, and a source of energy, Europa could produce life. But it's unlikely that we'll find anything but tiny microbes. Wow, the NASA hotline is ringing off the hook. The call center operator is all sweaty from stress. They barely have time to answer the phone, and all the messages they get say the same thing. There's something glowing on the moon. Indeed, hundreds and thousands of amateur astronomers were watching the moon that night. And suddenly, there was a bright light on it, as if someone had lit a powerful spotlight on the surface. Scientists immediately began to look for an explanation to this phenomenon. They first thought it was simply the glow of an airplane flying between the observers and the moon. But then it wouldn't have been seen by so many people from different parts of the world at the same time. The next suspects were the Starlink satellites. Theoretically, one of them could have played a cruel trick on amateur astronomers. They could have mistaken the small satellite's light for a flash of light on the moon. But then again, if the satellite were the culprit of this mess, the flare wouldn't be static, but moving. While some scientists continue to search for an answer to this mystery, others decide to investigate the phenomenon in more detail. For this purpose, they have built a new telescope north of Seville, Spain. The conditions there are quite suitable for observing the moon. The telescope has 2 cameras, controlled remotely from the campus in Germany. If both cameras pick up any unusual phenomenon on the surface of the moon, it will quickly zoom the telescope there to see what's going on. It'll also require advanced artificial intelligence to teach the cameras to distinguish between the unexplained phenomenon on the moon and the light of an airplane, a satellite, or a small meteorite that just entered the Earth's atmosphere. While the telescope is doing its investigation, we already have a theory that may explain the appearance of such bright round flashes on the moon's surface. So, the moon influences the tides of the seas and oceans on Earth with its gravitational force. But the Earth can affect the moon in the same way. Only the force will be 32.5 times stronger. While the moon orbits the Earth, at one point it may be as close to our planet as possible. Then the force of the interaction will be greatest. At this point, tidal forces may force cracks in the surface of the moon to open and release gas from its interior. A powerful jet of gas will lift the lunar dust with it, and what we see as a bright flash through our telescopes is really just a fog of dust, which is round and reflects sunlight well. If you look at it from a distance, it really does look like a flash. As the dust rises, we think there's been a small explosion, and that flash gradually fades as the dust settles down. These things happen all the time on the moon's surface. They're called transient lunar phenomena, and besides lunar flashes, much more mystical and bizarre things have happened. Back in 1178, 5 monks claimed to have seen the moon, being in the shape of a horn, begin to split in 2 from an upper point. Then fire and sparks began to blaze from the place of separation. It was as if a dragon were spewing flames. In the next moment, the moon began to pulsate and then returned to its calm state. This phenomenon was repeated more than 10 times, and the flames took different shapes each time. When this nightmare was over, the moon turned black. It wasn't until the 20th century that scientists tried to explain the phenomenon. They theorized that a large asteroid collided with the moon at the time, and it was this asteroid that should be blamed for creating the Giordano Bruno crater, 15 Brooklyn bridges wide. But in that case, millions of tons of fragments from the asteroid would have hit the Earth as well, and then people would have seen an incredible meteor shower. It would have been very bright, and the memories of it would definitely have been in the archives. But that didn't happen. Now the phenomenon the monks observed seems questionable. Perhaps they did see an asteroid fall, only it was falling on the Earth itself, and they perceived the light from the burning meteorite as something sinister happening on the moon. Or maybe the monks were simply imagining things. There's no witnesses to this event other than them. Another unusual phenomenon is the blue and red lights on the moon. They can be seen when it's horn-shaped, and this occurs most often in the Aristarchus crater. The flashes come and go very quickly, almost like lightning. In fact, this is electricity. Tidal forces are to blame for this too. They cause mechanical stress to build up in the rocks. This can produce an electric field, which creates the blue flashes that have surprised many amateur astronomers. There can also be starbursts on the moon. We can blame this on meteorites that fall on the surface. Because the moon has no atmosphere, asteroids that approach it don't burn up. Having a lot of weight and speed, they cause an explosion on impact. And here on Earth, we see it as a starburst. For example, on May 13, 1972, there was a meteorite impact of 1,000 tons of TNT near where Apollo 14 landed. If we lived much earlier, we might have witnessed constant bright flashes on the moon's surface. All the craters there are formed by such meteor strikes. So imagine the fireworks that were there years ago. And a lot of those meteorites were even useful too. They brought water with them. Yes, there is water on the moon. NASA confirmed this fact after studies with the SOFIA telescope. It was mounted on an airplane. The observations were made from the upper atmosphere of the Earth. At such an altitude, the dry air allowed the telescope to see even the smallest details. Water might have been in the craters at the poles of the moon. These places have never seen light, and the water there might be encased in ice. But SOFIA found water on the sunlit surface of the moon. Of course, it's only H2O molecules that are present in the dust layers, but that's something. If we manage to collect all this water, we'll get very little of it. In comparison, the Sahara Desert has about 100 times more water than we found on the moon. But an even more unusual phenomenon is happening there right now. The moon is actually rusting, just like a piece of old metal. For rust to appear, we need iron, water, and oxygen. Lunar soil has enough iron in it, and as we've already learned, there's some water too. The last piece of the puzzle is oxygen. Everyone knows there's no atmosphere on the moon, and we can't breathe there, but oxygen is still present. The solar wind brought it there. The wind from our warm star moves at an extremely high speed. It scrapes oxygen from the upper parts of our atmosphere and carries it further through space. Eventually, the wind with the oxygen molecules reaches the moon. Voila! All the ingredients for corrosion are in place, and the iron ore on the surface of the moon begins to take on a reddish hue. If this process goes on long enough, in the distant future, the moon will look like Mars. It will turn orange-red. Yes, the signature color of Mars came exactly from that corrosion that began there thousands and thousands of years ago, when there were rivers and seas with water and an atmosphere with oxygen. Other strange objects that can be seen on the moon were left there by humans. Between 1969 and 1972, 12 people visited there as part of the Apollo program. In all, there were 6 landing sites where the astronauts left a bunch of stuff behind. Besides a couple of dozen satellites and spacecraft that fell or landed softly on the moon, there's a lunar rover, some United States flags, a family photo of one of the astronauts, and even 3 golf balls. And the first 2 people to be on the moon left behind a whole pile of stuff. When they were about to go home, they took a lot of soil samples and rocks with them. And to carry it all away, they had to get rid of everything unnecessary on board the lunar module. The TV camera, the sample collection tools, the science equipment, and even the armrests from the seats. The astronauts stood outside the lunar module for a full 8 minutes and threw out a whole mountain of unnecessary items. If you collect all these objects and debris that we left there by 12 astronauts and put them on the scales, it will show about 199 tons. It's like 3 heavy armored tanks or 3 large passenger planes. Strange, but true. Now, don't get all upset, but the moon is shrinking and getting wrinkled, pretty much like a grape turning into a raisin. That happens because our natural satellite has been retaining its inner heat for over 4 billion years. but its core is gradually cooling down and becoming more dense, like me. Unlike a grape's flexible skin, the Moon's surface is pretty brittle. This brittleness causes faults to form where different sections of the crust push up against each other, leading to what scientists call moonquakes. So far, our satellite has shrunk by around 150 feet in circumference. It's such a tiny change that it won't affect the look of eclipses or the phases of the Moon. Even tidal cycles won't be affected since the Moon's mass hasn't really changed. The shrinking process won't directly affect us down here, but that doesn't mean that all humans are safe. Moonquakes, caused by the shrinking process, have been a concern for years. During the famous Apollo missions, NASA astronauts left seismometers at different points on the Moon. Those are devices capable of identifying seismic activity on the lunar surface with exceptional precision. The equipment was operational for several years, and it managed to capture over 12,000 moonquakes, ranging in magnitudes from 2 to 5. Up until 1977, the team was able to identify 4 distinct types of quakes. Some tremors, like those caused by meteorite impacts, were relatively easy to identify. But the cause of the so-called shallow moonquakes remains a mystery to scientists, and that can be an obstacle to future missions on lunar soil. As the name suggests, shallow moonquakes occur relatively close to the surface, typically between 30 to 135 miles beneath the surface. Recent research suggests that these tremors are triggered by the compression of the Moon's surface, leading to the formation of thrust faults, where one surface layer is pushed up over another. This study also discovered where the epicenters of the strongest ones were. It all started in the South Pole region, precisely where we want to settle down. Interest in the lunar South Pole peaked in 2023, when India's Chandrayaan mission successfully landed and deployed a rover to explore the area. NASA also has plans for the same spot. And their ambitious goal is to take astronauts there for the very first time. The Artemis-3 mission, scheduled for 2026, currently has 13 potential landing spots at the South Pole, represented by the blue squares here. One of the options is situated within a geological feature called Digurlok Rim 2, which is a strategic area for exploration. It might have ice, because parts of it are completely in the dark, but it's close enough to areas that do have sunlight, which is crucial as a source of power. Now, take a look at the pink dots on that same map. They represent possible epicenters of the strongest moonquakes recorded by the Apollo missions. That means that thrust faults in the area could be relatively young and potentially active, representing a real danger to the Artemis-3 crew. These astronauts will journey to lunar orbit over the course of 30 days, and 2 crew members will descend to the surface, spending about a week at the South Pole. Their moonwalk will be particularly challenging, given the extreme temperatures of these permanently shadowed regions. The presence of moonquakes and possible landslides only adds more danger to this mission, as this phenomenon is far more frightening than earthquakes. The strongest moonquake ever recorded had a magnitude of 5.7. You might think that's not a big deal, considering that countries like Chile, Colombia, and Papua New Guinea experienced earthquakes of similar magnitude in 2023 without significant damage. But the gravitational pull on the Moon is relatively weaker than on Earth, so what feels like a gentle tremor on our planet might be a real ground-shaking event up there. This happens because you're not as firmly connected to the surface of the Moon as you are on Earth, meaning that seismic waves can cause the surface to move more freely. There's also a huge difference in duration. Earthquakes typically last between 10 and 30 seconds, with some lasting up to 2 minutes. A moonquake can persist much longer than that. Our satellite is essentially a solid, rigid, and dry sphere. So, when a tremor shakes the Moon's surface, it resonates powerfully without any natural means of dissipation. Moonquakes can last for a good 10 minutes, or even longer, with little tremors sticking around for hours afterwards. Now, these new findings about shallow moonquakes won't actually change the potential landing sites for Artemis 3. and they won't affect the duration of the mission either. That's because accurately estimating how often a specific region experiences these tremors is tricky and unpredictable. What scientists do know is that these shallow quakes aren't very common and pose a low risk to short-term missions on the lunar surface. But that situation changes completely if we consider long-term habitation on the Moon, and that could happen sooner than we expect. The Artemis 3 mission represents an important first step towards space colonization. China is also making the first moves to establish a permanent lunar base at the South Pole by 2040. Their strategy involves utilizing 3D printing and brick production from lunar soil for constructing the moon base. That definitely sounds fascinating, but putting together a setup like that comes with a bunch of challenges, including dealing with intense cosmic radiation, the lack of water, and of course, long-lasting moonquakes. Over billions of years, the surface of the Moon has been hit by asteroids and comets, causing bits and pieces to constantly break off from the impacts. Because of this, all the surface material is pretty loosely packed, so when there are quakes, slopes in the same area can become susceptible to landslides or new faults opening up. Future settlements located too close to these unstable slopes could put everyone living inside these lunar bases at risk. Moon dust adds another layer of complexity because, without erosion or water to smooth it out, it can harden to the point of being as tough as glass. If we really want to understand how dangerous moonquakes might be for people living and working on the Moon in the future, space agencies still need to map out and get new seismic data, and not just from the South Pole, but from the entire satellite. In 2025, the Far-Side Seismic Suite Mission, or FSS, plans to deploy two of the most high-precision seismometers ever built to the Schrödinger crater, which is located on the dark side of the Moon. Finding out what's happening on the ground there is crucial for understanding the complex lunar structure and its internal dynamics. Scientists are still trying to figure out whether the lack of recorded seismic activity on the far side of the Moon is due to current instruments not being capable of detecting it, or if it's due to some kind of interference from melted material in the mantle. Once they have this answer, it will be easier to fully understand the phenomenon of shallow moonquakes and assess their implications for future neighborhoods on our natural satellite. Now, you may have heard that Earth is also shrinking, but it's a different process. Basically, the Moon is getting smaller mainly because its core is cooling down naturally. The Earth's core is cooling too, but our planet got its crust with tectonic plates, unlike the Moon, which only has one plate. So the energy from Earth's core shifts those plates around or comes through volcanic eruptions. Earth is actually losing mass overall due to atmospheric loss. Our planet loses about 100 million pounds of mass per year, mostly from a leaky atmosphere. Earth's gravity isn't strong enough to retain the lightest particles, like hydrogen and helium, which escape into space. But don't worry, these numbers aren't cause for alarm, considering that our planet's atmosphere weighs about 5 quadrillion tons, a number I can't even imagine. So, in other words, it would take many, many, many times the current age of the universe for it to completely evaporate. Well, that makes me breathe easier. How about you? Okay, I officially give up on the hope that the Moon is made of cheese after all. Wow, not even Gouda. The shiny lunar ball, or a curved banana, or half of a coin, depending on what phase it's in, has different layers inside, just like Earth. One of these layers is called the inner core. About 20 years ago, scientists were observing how the Moon rotates. Using that data, they concluded that it had a fluid outer core, but the inner core was hard to study, so they didn't know if it was solid like a rock or molten like a hot liquid. But things are clearer now. Astronomers have collected data from different missions, including the Apollo missions, where astronauts went to the Moon and gathered information themselves. Plus, they've used a special technique called seismic data. This method is all about studying how sound waves move through things. Take earthquakes on our planet as an example. When an earthquake happens, it creates waves that travel through the ground. Scientists can detect and analyze these waves to learn more about Earth's interior. The same idea can apply to other objects in our solar system, or planets, or, in this case, the Moon. When quakes or moonquakes happen, they generate sound waves, and by carefully listening to and studying these waves, scientists can create a detailed map of what's inside the object. They can figure out things like different layers, what they're made of, and how they're arranged. To check the Moon's deep interior, scientists also use something called laser ranging. This method measures the distance between the surface of the Earth and the Moon very precisely. And ta-da! Our natural satellite's inner core is a dense, solid ball made of iron, just like Earth's. It's about 310 miles wide, which is nearly 15% the size of the entire Moon. Researchers also have stumbled upon evidence that supports the theory that the layer between the Moon's surface and its core, called the mantle, has been moving around as the Moon evolved over time. This movement is something we call lunar mantle overturn, and it could explain why we find elements rich in iron on the lunar surface. Mantle material ends up being carried upward, and the volcanic rock remains in the Moon's crust. Some of the materials in this rock were too dense, like me, so they just sank back through the lighter crust material all the way to the core mantle boundary. It's like a cycle where the Moon's mantle material goes up during volcanic activity, carries iron-rich elements to the surface, and then sinks back down. There's another mystery scientists have been trying to solve. What caused the Moon's magnetic field to weaken and nearly disappear over time? It seems that now that we know about the iron core and the global mantle overturn, we might get some more answers about the Moon's magnetic field. Knowing what the inner core is like can help us better understand the Moon's history as well as the history of our entire solar system. Now, one of the theories that's widely accepted about the origin of the Moon says there was a massive collision between Earth, in its early stages, and another mysterious object in our solar system. It's called the Large Impact Theory, and this collision was so strong it ripped off a big chunk of the primitive molten Earth. I mean, not so big compared to what's left. If you put a US nickel next to a green pea, you get a good idea of how big our planet is compared to the Moon. Now, this chunk was set into orbit around our planet, and this might have happened about 95 million years after our solar system formed. The object that collided with Earth could have been about 10% the mass of our home planet and roughly the size of Mars. Well, it makes sense. Earth and the Moon do have similar compositions after all. Of course, there are other ideas about how the Moon formed. One says that the gravitational force of our planet captured it. This means that the Moon was just an object innocently passing by when suddenly it got attracted and pulled into Earth's orbit. There's even a hypothesis that Earth stole the Moon from Venus. Ooh. In that case, the Moon shouldn't complain. I guess the view is way better here. So yeah, the Moon and Earth are similar when it comes to rocks and some minerals. But the Moon doesn't have the same atmosphere as our planet. Its atmosphere is thin and consists of some weird gases that include potassium and sodium, which is not something you can find in the atmosphere of Mars, Venus, or Earth. And the rocks on the Moon don't contain water. But that doesn't mean there's no water at all up there. A long time ago, in the 17th century, astronomers saw large dark spots on the Moon's surface. One of these astronomers thought these spots looked like oceans, and he called them maria, which means seas in Latin. Other astronomers also made maps of the Moon, and they used the term maria to describe these dark spots. For example, Mare Tranquillitatis translates to Sea of Tranquility, where Apollo 11 made its touchdown. But it seems those dark spots are not actually oceans. They are plains made of hardened lava that erupted long ago. These volcanic eruptions left behind smooth flat areas called basalt plains. In the late 1800s, one sky watcher studied the Moon and found it didn't have an atmosphere. Without an atmosphere, there are no clouds and no air to keep water from evaporating. So scientists thought that any water on the Moon would just disappear right away. They believed the Moon was totally dry. But then, in 1961, one physicist had a different idea. He pointed out there could be water on the Moon in special areas called permanently shadowed regions. These are spots on the moon where the sun doesn't shine, so they stay dark all the time. Water ice could exist in these dark areas because they're extremely cold and the ice wouldn't evaporate. But when astronauts from the Apollo missions went to the moon, they brought back soil samples, and scientists found no signs of water in them. So everyone went back to thinking that the moon was completely dry. In the 90s, NASA focused on these shadowed craters and found high concentrations of hydrogen, which meant there could be ice at the moon's poles. They still weren't certain, so they kept digging and after a while found hydrogen trapped inside tiny beads of volcanic glass. Since there are no active volcanoes on the moon today, which means water probably was present on the moon when these volcanoes erupted long ago. Plus, there could be way more water back in the early days of our moon. In 2020, NASA's SOFIA mission showed us what we'd been looking for a really long time. There is water on the moon after all. It turns out the water is hidden within the grains of lunar dust or sticking to the surface in the sunlit areas of the moon. So there are no oceans like we have on Earth, but at least there's something. The question remains, how did water even get there? It seems the moon had a chaotic history back at the time when it was forming, as probably most of the planets and moons in our solar system. So there is some evidence that water came there from comets hitting its surface back in the old days, or maybe even keeps on coming from those that are slamming into the moon right now. We're talking about a chaotic situation where icy micrometeorites collide with the moon's surface, and dust then makes an even bigger mess when interacting with the solar wind. But we're waiting to find out more about this. Because, as we all know, when you mention water, you also inevitably talk about life. That's why we want to know more, for instance, about all that ice hidden in polar craters on the moon. Maybe it can teach us more about how life developed on Earth. Maybe comets brought all the necessary elements here. Then, what if there are some of those elements stuck in the ice on the moon, too?
About 8 billion inhabitants of planet Earth found out the same terrible news in one day. Someone saw it on TV. Others heard it on the phone while scrolling through social media or listening to music. Some witnessed this news in a dream while sleeping. Someone's voice said it in all languages to ensure everyone understood it. I have good news and bad news for you. Let's start with the bad news. You're all characters in YouTube videos in which your planet gets into a situation where the moon breaks in half. For the audience, it will be a hypothetical story, but for you, these events will become a reality. The good news is that I was joking. There's no good news. But don't worry, the apocalypse won't start on your planet. Maybe just a little bit. Have a nice day. At first, the entire population panics. Then, a few days later, everyone calms down. Maybe it was a mass hallucination, and the moon will be alright. But at this moment, scientists have discovered the danger. A colossal meteorite is flying towards us from the distant depths of space. This meteorite is super fast and pretty flat, but has sharp edges. Fortunately, it will miss the Earth by a few thousand miles, but the moon won't be that lucky. The meteorite flies through our Earth's only natural satellite directly in the middle. So it passes through the moon, sweeps past our planet, and flies away into distant space. At this moment, all people can't take their eyes off the moon. The meteorite cuts it perfectly in half, gently, clearly, painlessly. So, what shall we do now? Will the Earth survive this? Our satellite breaks into 2 equal parts, but fortunately, they don't fly away from each other. The moon's great gravity attracts them back like a magnet. Scientists are sure that the parts will connect in a couple of billion years, and the moon will become the same as it used to be. But the coolest thing is that people won't feel any changes. Everyone around the world will celebrate this good news. The voice was wrong. But then, another problem appears. A massive meteorite in the form of a shoe is flying from the deepest space to us. It enters our solar system and approaches the Earth at high speed. The space boot crashes into one half of the moon and then flies away. Now, the moon is definitely breaking into 2 parts. The first half remains in the same place. The second one is flying towards us. A small meteor shower begins on Earth because of the falling moon fragments, but it's not so bad. Most of these rocks are burning up in the atmosphere. But almost the entire split-off half is falling apart around the orbit of our planet. It forms a stone belt. Now the Earth is like Saturn. Rotating fragments destroy part of our artificial satellites. Communication and the internet work inconsistently. It takes people a couple of years to restore a stable connection. The International Space Station no longer exists. Luckily, all the astronauts managed to return to Earth before half the moon got to them. So, moon rocks are flying around the planet, and people see half the moon in the sky. Life doesn't change much for the first few days, but those who live on the coast of the seas and oceans notice the consequences. The moon used to influence the tides. It was flying around the Earth and made oceans take an oval shape. There were tides on the side where the moon was closer. There were ebbs on the opposite side. But now, this schedule is wrong. Half of the moon attracts less water. Yes, the moon lost half its weight and began approaching the Earth. But its gravitational force has become weaker. Seabirds, many species of fish, sea turtles, and other coastal animals may not survive these changes. Their natural instincts associated with the moon help them determine the time for getting food, breeding, and flying south. For example, tiny turtles expect a strong tide in the morning. They run to the water, but the water doesn't reach them. Turtles can't hide in the ocean in time and become dinner for seagulls. Crabs can't lay eggs because the tide has started earlier than usual. Wolves go mad in the woods. They howl loudly every night and can't stop. The whole natural world can't understand what's going on. The human body is also feeling some discomfort. Many people have low and high blood pressure, and some experience severe headaches. Half of the moon changes the entire ecosystem of the planet. Adapting to new conditions will take several tens, maybe hundreds of years. A couple of weeks pass, and people notice the days are now shorter. The moon always slowed the Earth's rotation and made one day last 24 hours. The Earth is spinning faster now. The night and the morning come earlier than everyone is used to. Earth rotation speed has increased and reduced the number of hours per day to 15. People suffer from insomnia or oversleeping. The body needs time to get used to it. Work schedules are changing all over the world. Previously, people came to the office at 9 and left at 6. Now, they arrive at 7 and leave at 2 p.m. Sleep time got shorter, and people are really sad because of this. Progress slows down because the short working time. The technologies of the future are now 20 to 30 years late. Hourly pay remains the same, so bosses now pay less for fewer working hours. The whole moon stabilized the weather and climate on the planet. Look at Mars. It has 2 small moons. They quickly spin around it and rock Mars around on its axis. As a result, strong winds, sandstorms, and thunderstorms often happen on the red planet. Now the half of the moon that approached us takes the Earth out of stable rotation. This changes the seasonal temperatures in the world. It even gets hotter in hot places. And snowstorms are raging in cold regions. There are short, massive downpours instead of sunny weather. A typical breeze can grow into a hurricane and small waves into a tsunami. The seasons are changing faster now. Winters are colder and summers are hotter. Changing the rotation of the planet affects the Earth's magnetic field. Since the compass and navigation systems are unstable now, we need to recalculate where the north and south are. Birds can't fly south to wait out the winter since they don't know what direction to fly. Their inner compass is broken. Several hundred years have passed. People are entirely accustomed to the new conditions on Earth. New species of animals and fish have appeared. Birds can navigate the sky by the moon again. The planet's economy has been restored. Hourly wages have become higher. People now get enough sleep from 5 to 6 hours a day and work for 4 to 5 hours. The reduction of day and night has also affected the entertainment industry. Movies now last 1 hour. One episode of some TV series lasts 30 minutes. Life goes faster. An average person now lives to be 96 years old. In fact, the passage of time hasn't changed at all. Its calculus did. Several thousand years have passed. People look different now. Now they have big eyes that absorb more light. Half of the moon doesn't shine as bright as the whole thing, so the nights have become darker. It took the human eye a couple of thousand years to develop the ability to see clearly in this new dark. Animals need to navigate better in these conditions, so their eyes have become larger and more sensitive. During all this time, people have cleared the orbit of moon rocks. Several space stations fly around our planet. And again, people hear this strange voice that once told them that they were all characters in one hypothetical YouTube video. This time, the voice says, "Your story ends because the video ends. I'm sorry. Good night."